Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and a lot of my friends and guildies have decided to reroll rogues. So I took it upon myself to help teach them a little bit of Subtlety, Assassination, and even Outlaw. In my time spent, I ended up playing a little bit of Subtlety recently. I also ended up doing a bit more research to help my friends adjust to the playstyle, help them with the bars and abilities and the general mentality. And after doing some more research after that, I feel pretty confident in making this PvE guide for Subtlety rogues. I am gonna get a PvP guide for Assassination very soon, as well as Subtlety, but with how much grind I'm having to do on my Outlaw for all the gear as well as PvP, I'm just having so much fun, but I will get to them as soon as possible. In this video, we'll talk about talents, the best possible stats, the best possible traits, as well as the general playstyle rotation, and what are some of the other builds out there for Subtlety in Battle for Azeroth. My favorite part to talk about when it comes to guides is the talents. So let's start off with the talents first. What are going to be the talents for you for PvE in AoE or single target? This is going to be your single target build right here. And let's talk about some of the other talents you guys can take in order to mix it up a little. Find Weakness in level 15 row is going to end up being the best. Subtlety is a spec that's all about maintaining a lot of buffs and debuffs, and Find Weakness is another one to maintain. Getting good at maintaining this one and sinking as much damage during Find Weakness windows is going to be a part of the parts for Subtlety. But if you're new to the spec, it's a good idea to try out Weapon Master. It has a bit of RNG, but getting more value Shadow Strikes and Backstabs can sometimes help you kind of ease yourself into the spec and figure out what are the abilities you should be using and how you should approach this spec in terms of PvE damage. At level 30, Shadow Focus ends up being the best choice. Shadow Focus ends up smoothing out our playstyle during Shadow Dance windows, and having a smooth Shadow Dance window is going to increase your damage rather than even going for something like Night Stalker, which is a flat damage increase but more turbulence when it comes to your energy. At level 45, you're mostly going to stick with Mark for Death. It's a great cooldown. Mark for Death eviscerates are very useful, especially on mobs that are right about to die, letting you kind of pad and get more damage out. If you are playing AoE, however, you'll be using Shuriken Storm. Shuriken Storm generates a common point per target that it hits, so you're trying to gather as many common points as possible, so Deeper Stratagem lets you not be wasteful in AoE situations, as well as smack the enemy back for a little bit extra damage when it comes to AoE. At level 60, if you're doing world content, Soothing Darkness I think is a-okay, because you'll be moving from stealth to stealth a lot, so you'll be able to re-heal after fighting rares and bosses and NPCs whenever you're getting your quest done. But if you're doing PvE content, raids or dungeons, True Death is a great one for learning content, and even after knowing what the content is, it'll allow you to survive certain attacks and even mechanics that would otherwise kill you. So if you're learning the fights, you not dying the first time and adjusting and learning the fights is great, but also you being able to use this in situations where you can just ignore mechanics and continue DPS in the boss can also be useful. Elusiveness has some very minor use. It's a great talent on its own, pretty good for PvP, but there's only a few abilities that are non-area of effect, like full single target damage. Rogues are generally squishy, so we usually would die to those mechanics, but sometimes you'll be able to combo Elusiveness, mostly in Mythic Plus Dungeon type of content. At level 75, it's really a choice up to you, but I just want to kind of lead you guys towards one or the other and help you explain where these choices would be useful. Shot in the Dark is a new one for Battle for Azeroth. After entering Stealth or Shadow Dance, your next cheap shot is free. This can actually be pretty good in Mythic Plus scenarios where you have certain mobs that need to be crowd controlled. So to be able to go for Shadow Dance Cheap Shot means that you're able to stun the enemy, or Cheap Shot in the opener without having to waste the energy allows you to build the combo points as well as lock the enemy down. The problem with this one is during your Shadow Dance windows, you will probably not be cheap shotting a lot of enemies, or you'll try not to. You're trying to get as many Shadow Strikes in there as possible, but I guess in Mythic Pluses, sacrifices must be made. Night Terrors is actually pretty cool, because Subtlety generally doesn't have any AoE slows. Really, none of the rogue specs besides Assass has AoE slow, and that's only tied to the crippling poison. So Night Terrors in certain dungeons where mobs need to be slowed, even though it's not the most effective slow, only 30% efficiency, ends up being a fairly decent one when you need any kind of AoE slow for the group. Prey on the Weak ends up being actually very solid. Being able to throw the enemy into a cheap shot or a kidney makes them take more damage. In Mythic Plus dungeons with certain mobs that would otherwise obliterate your team, you can kind of build combo points, get them in a full kidney, let everybody else burst, and as a group effort, you're able to take down those enemies faster. At level 90, it's going to be choice between Envelop in Shadows or Dark Shadow. I'll talk about Dark Shadow in a second. Envelop in Shadows is the best option for single target, gives you an extra charge of Shadow Dance, allows you more of a sustainy, Shadow Strike spammy playstyle. Whether you like that or not, this one is the best one for single target output. At level 100, Master of Shadows and Secret Technique are both viable options. We'll talk about Sec Tech in a second. Master of Shadows ends up granting you extra energy every time you go into Stealth or Shadow Dance. So this one ends up smoothing out your playstyle, allowing you again more Shadow Strikes and Eviscerates to spam. However, if you're playing an AoE build, if it's a full AoE, you can go for Deeper Strat. If not, Mark for Death ends up being a decent option. So for any kind of AoE, usually this is where you would want to go with Burst, trying to burst as many enemies as possible in a single go. You'll want to swap out of Envelop in Shadows from a spammy Shadow Strike spam build towards Dark Shadow. More of a careful planning with Shadow Dance, careful planning with your Burst, but trying to unleash and throw as many cooldowns into the enemy as possible during those opener windows. Dark Shadow increases your damage by 24% and combos really well with Sec Tech. Sec Tech is a cool new finisher. It replaces Death from Above but functions very similar. It'll deal damage to everybody else around you in a cleave playstyle, but also has a fairly decent single target damage potential. It has a 45-second cooldown, which is reduced by 1 second per every combo point that you spend into a finisher, so you'll be able to use it fairly often. 30 energy and combos really well together with Dark Shadow, Find Weakness, maybe a Mark for Death into a big Sec Tech on a group of enemies. So with this being said, now you can kind of have a build that you want to play for single target or AoE, depending on situation. I personally like Dark Shadow Sec Tech even in single target situations, because I like seeing big numbers from Subtlety. But if you're going to be doing raids, you will probably want to stick with Envelop in Shadows and Master of Shadow, as they do the most amount of damage for you. Let's talk a bit about stats. And for Subtlety, stats are a little bit weird right now. I will show you guys on screen my current stat weights from raid bots, and you should always sim your character because the sims change depending on gear that you got, depending on the type of trinkets you have, and depending on your weapons and even traits. With the current best in slot gear that I can get for the most amount of damage for my Subtlety playstyle, Haste ends up being the best trait. Of course, you know, you should get a stronger weapon in your main hand, and of course you should stack as much agility. I think that most of those things are pretty common, but after you get as much agility and best weapon in main hand possible, and it actually ends up stacking for me a bit more haste for more damage increase, and I'll explain why haste in a second. After that, for me, ends up being crit fairly close behind. Versatility starts to kind of drop off, but then mastery ends up being at the very bottom, which I'm actually kind of confused, but I guess it kind of makes sense. With the playstyle for Subtlety, haste ends up empowering your shadow techniques. Well, also makes you hit a lot more with your daggers. Your auto attacks ends up being a huge portion of your damage for just about every single melee class in Battle for Azeroth. So having more haste means more auto attacks, but on top of it, more auto attacks means more chances for a combo point to generate and extra energy to come back. With you having fairly low energy playstyle as is, and taking a lot of talents to help you smooth out that energy, Shadow Techniques ends up being fairly good, granting you more combo points, so more eviscerates, more energy to build the combo points, so more Shadow Strikes. Overall, very good synergy together with haste, auto attacks, Shadow Techniques, and I guess a little bit of Nightblade as well, since technically you do get more ticks in the duration with more haste. Then crit ends up being the best because, well, if your ability is crit during your burst, then you're probably doing the most amount of damage. So crit ends up being the most consistent. After that, versatility, which buffs your finishers, shadow strikes, auto attacks, just about every single damage output. And after that, mastery for your finishers. Your finishers are a huge part of your gameplay, but currently, early in Battle for Azeroth, haste ends up being a little bit stronger for pure PvE situations, mostly because of the auto attack thing, the shadow techniques, the energy regen, the common point generation, so it kind of just ends up going together. But of course, you should sim your character. You should always run sims on your character with the gear you have to find out the best stat currently for you. I'm guessing with Subtlety, haste is going to be good up until a certain point, where then critical strike, mastery, and even versatility will start making a little bit more sense. And of course, all of these stat weights will be different whether you're playing with a pure single target build or whether you go Secret Technique, Dark Shadow type of playstyle. Some of the things to note for Subtlety in terms of gear. Always have daggers in your main hand and offhand. Like, your daggers are so important. Even in the offhand, I try to improve my damage and my, I guess, playstyle and my item level by dropping in a heavier sword in my offhand. The sword is 340 item level, versatility mastery, has agility gem and quick navigation enchant. And then I send my character and actually do less damage than I do with a full dagger. Having dagger in main hand and offhand is generally going to be good, but of course you should sim your character whenever possible. Now quickly I want to talk a bit about the traits, and I'll link for you guys an image with hero damage on it. It will show you some of the different traits. I'll have the link to the hero damage down below. This one shows you what the spec is like and which traits end up helping you the best. Blade in the Shadows right now is leading, after that is Inevitability, but then you'll see a lot of the middle ground traits like Thunderous Blast, Laser Matrix, Tidal Surge, Dagger in the Back, Unstable Catalyst, Battlefield Focus, Sylvanas' Resolve, Resonance Fury, and more actually being fairly viable. So if at any point you're not quite sure or you don't really know how to read any of these charts, or maybe just somebody who's new to Rogue and are willing to take a look at this information at a later time in more detail, it is a good idea to stick with more middle ground traits for now, no matter what trait it is. Alright, let's talk a bit about the playstyle for Subtlety. What are you going to be doing and how are you going to play the spec? For the most part, you will want to try to maintain Shadow Blades on cooldown as often as possible. So in a dungeon run or in a raid run, you'll want to use this cooldown as often as you can. Most of your opener will start with you in stealth with Shadow Dance. Also, you're going to want to maintain Nightblade basically throughout your whole fight. It provides a 50% damage increase on the enemy, and your auto attacks, Shadow Strikes, and Eviscerates are all going to thank you for the extra damage. You also have an ability called Symbols of Death. You'll want to combine that one together with Shadow Dance as often as possible. So if you're trying to use Shadow Dance appropriately, you will want to aim to be between 40, 50, and 60 energy, activate Shadow Dance and Symbols of Death together. If you don't have Symbols of Death available, but you do have a Shadow Dance charge, then you'll want to start between 80, 90 energy in order to get the most value out of it. Mark for Death, if talented, should be used on cooldown at all times. You can also use the ability of Vanish offensively to cast a Shadow Strike in the enemy, so you can maintain the Find Weakness buff a lot easier, especially useful for bursty builds. You should be dumping as many common points into Eviscerate at 4 or more common points generally, and the rest of the time you should be casting Shadow Strike as often as you can, especially whenever Shadow Dance is available. Whenever that's not available, just spam backstab behind the target for more damage, so you can do 20% more damage if you are at least on the flank of the enemy. For multi-target, basically, you'll want to replace your Shadow Strikes and backstabs with Shuriken Storm, and then continue on your merry way, just like how you would in your single target playstyle. What's important for Subtlety is your opener though. If you get a nice beefy opener, then you generally set yourself up for success with your damage. Now, openers and being able to set them up every single time with Subtlety is going to take a bit of practice, especially if you are new. So remembering the sequence is kind of difficult. You can always make a macro, kind of like a one-shot macro, but generally I try to advise away from that, as most people will just use the macro, they'll spam it out, and generally they don't go to dissect the macro, they don't go to learn it. So it's a good idea to just learn the abilities as they come. You'll open up with a Shadow Blades before the fight, and you'll pop a potion if you have one available. You'll cast Shadow Strike into a Nightblade, Shadow Dance and Symbols of Death together, 2 Shadow Strikes, and Eviscerate or Secret Technique if you're talented. Shadow Strike twice, Eviscerate, Mark for Death, Eviscerate, Shadow Dance, Shadow Strike twice, Eviscerate, Shadow Strike twice, and then apply Nightblade. And then from there you continue in your rotation. Whenever you have Shadow Dance available and it's about to get to 2 charges, you should always use it and try to have as much energy unless you have Symbols of Death. Try to sink as many Shadow Strikes and Eviscerates into that window as possible. Generally, you should be able to sink 2 Shadow Strikes, 1 Eviscerate, then 2 more Shadow Strikes before Shadow Dance windows are off. And then from there, it's a lot of playstyle, it's a lot of practice with the spec and practicing the rotation. It is very important to know what you're supposed to do with your Shadow Dance windows. Whenever you have a Shadow Dance charge available and you're trying to dump as much damage into the enemy, Generally, you will want to have your debuff rolling. You'll want to be able to have no common points at the start. Whether you have Symbols of Death or just Shadow Dance, you should be able to use this just fine. You pop Shadow Dance. If Symbols of Death is available, pop it together. Shadow Strike, Eviscerate, or Secret Technique, then Shadow Strike, and then from there you can decide what to do with the rest of the common points, whether you can get a free Eviscerate, or maybe it's about time for Nightblade to be refreshed. When it comes to playing Subtlety in AoE situations, this is where it gets pretty interesting. Subtlety's AoE isn't really all about spreading damage to multiple enemies, but rather finding the biggest boss among them and focusing them down, using the fact that there's multiple enemies to empower that single target damage. The way that it works is, when you use Shuriken Storm, for every enemy that you hit with Shuriken Storm, it increases the damage of your next Eviscerate by 8%, which stacks up to 5 times. So as I'm hitting all these enemies here, I got a stack for a 24% damage buff and up to a maximum of 40% extra, so the enemy that I'm focusing on will take a hell of a lot more damage. The way you're supposed to use this, especially if you're playing something like Find Weakness, is open up on the enemy with a Shadow Strike, or try to weave in windows where you can use Shadow Dance and Shadow Strike together. Using Shadow Dance, by the way, increases the damage of your Shuriken Storm as well by about 50%. So you'll want to use this whenever you have any kind of damage, and if possible, maintain Find Weakness whenever you can. Also, you can use Shadow Blades together with your Shuriken Storm, because now Shadow Blades will empower any abilities that generate common points. So you'll have extra shadow damage with Shuriken Storm as well. So let me show you more or less what it's going to look like. You can start in the opener. Maybe you're going to pop a potion, pop Shadow Blades, Shadow Strike the main enemy, get a Nightblade on them, pop all your cooldowns and start AoEing the main enemy. Just Shuriken Storm, AoE, Shuriken Storm, AoE, Shuriken Storm, AoE, or Eviscerate, I guess. Trying to make sure Nightblade is back up, and you're just focusing that one target down. And you can use Shadow Dance charges available with you in order to do as much, or try to upkeep Find Weakness for as much as possible, and as well as to empower your Shuriken Storm to do more damage to everybody else around. If you're able to kind of combine them together like this with your Find Weaknesses, your Mark for Deaths, your charges of Shadow Dance, you should be good to go. If you're hitting only a few enemies, so instead of having 4 enemies, let's say you're hitting about 3 of them, it's a good idea whenever you don't have big bursts available, maybe you don't have Sectech available, maybe you don't have enough Shadow Dance charges for Dark Shadow, it's a good idea to just AoE and Nightblade the enemies. Let's say you have 3 enemies available, so what I'm going to do is Nightblade all 3 of them. By using common points into Nightblade, you are also getting back your Shadow Dance charges, so you can start doing damage right afterwards. So here we go, I'm just going to go damage. Just going to continue doing damage, so all 3 enemies are taking extra damage from Nightblade, which makes your damage output a little bit more value now. Of course, the playstyle with Secret Technique ends up being a lot more bursty. Basically, you will want to do a very similar thing, but now Secret Technique doesn't have the benefits of Shuriken Storm. So basically, I want to try to use this as often as possible in a group of enemies. So I'll do a very similar thing. I'll Shadow Strike them, Nightblade them. If I had my Mark for Death, I would use Mark for Death and Secret Technique whenever possible. Because this playstyle is all about increasing your damage using your Shadow Dance charges with Dark Shadow, you will want to try to pair Secret Technique and maybe big Eviscerates with your Shadow Dances as well. So you'll still want to maintain Nightblade on an enemy. You'll want to sometimes get other abilities in, like Secret Technique here for a big AoE on everybody. And I'll just try to maximize as much damage as I can during those Shadow Dance charges. When it comes to playing Subtlety, I personally find the Secret Technique build a lot more fun, especially with Dark Shadow, even in single target situations. I love one thing about Subtlety, and that is big damage on an enemy. Any kind of huge damage that I can put out, it makes me super excited, and I feel like that's always been the forte for Subtlety Rogues in previous expansions. But I guess it is possible to play with Enveloping Shadows and Master of Shadows if you do want to play a passive playstyle, which is technically better for single target. But honestly, I do prefer Dark Shadow and Secret Technique, especially in dungeon situations. And if all I end up using this is only for dungeons, not really in raids, then so be it. I honestly prefer the big burst playstyle regardless. I mean, the opener itself just looks absolutely amazing, and especially in short fights, this is where Subtlety is going to benefit in. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. I really do hope you enjoyed. Hopefully this video gave you guys a little bit of how to build your Subtlety Rogue and how to play the spec in order to deal the most amount of damage. Or if anything, I hope this video is at least going to be a nice stepping stone for anybody who's new to Subtlety and was trying to figure out how to play the spec. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want me to check out any of the other classes in general or any of the other specs, maybe for PvP, that I haven't got to cover so far. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see all of you guys in another video.